The question of God's existence invokes a long controversy.
There is no God.
You know for a fact that there is a God.
There is no God. There is no God.
What I said was, God exists, and he's American.
But in the proper light of science, anyone can see the truth.
Do you see the truth now?
Why can't you see the truth, huh?
Part 3 brings more incredible proofs from the natural world.
Incredible! They're talking apes!
While supposed experts claim all life gradually evolved after the Big Bang,
Why hasn't it evolved like the rest?
I don't know. Maybe because it was refrigerated?
you will see additional powerful evidence that everything around us could never be the product of cosmic accident.
I think we may have found your cosmic reason for being here.
Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. And today, that's part 3 of David C. Pack's Many Absolute Proofs of God series.
And now, David C. Pack.
First is the human eye.
Of course it is.
This amazing mechanism is spectacularly complex and an inspiring testimony to God's supreme intelligence.
Any theological argument from complexity is problematic on multiple fronts, not the least of which is that a mark of sophisticated design is simplicity rather than complexity. Complex systems arrive from attempts to navigate limitations and working with tools at hand, rather than the type of system one might arrive at free of constraints, like David's God would be. The argument from complexity is also an appeal to incredulity, or gaps in understanding. The inability for an individual, or indeed an entire species, to presently understand the inner workings or the developmental history of something tells us nothing about the origins of the thing. It's just an acknowledgement of the current lack of understanding. Lastly, complex things are inevitably a combination or accumulation of less complex things. The seeming weightiness of complexity arguments tend to fall flat when looking at a different scope or scale.
3 statements from one source represent the magnitude of difficulty in the human eye evolving to its extraordinary complexity. The most amazing component of the eye, as a camera, is its film or retina.
This part of the video was frustrating for me on a few fronts. David said his 3 statements are from one source, a potential red flag, but I may never know because while I'm familiar with David Menton, a retired biology professor currently on staff at Answers in Genesis, I can't find this The Eye work that is credited. It doesn't seem to be a book, or an AIG blog entry, or peer-reviewed paper, or YouTube video. There are some vague claims and confusing wording here that I'd love to have clarified with context.
And is vastly more sensitive to a wider range of light than any man-made film.
Now, I don't know if Menton's quote here uses film because it predates digital photography, or if he chose it because the limitations of film better illustrate his point, or for some other reason. But it's not even clear what he means here by range of light. There are certainly film and photosensors able to capture the ultraviolet and infrared spectrums of light that are not visible to the human eye. Perhaps he means dynamic range, the ratio between the lightest and darkest regions of a scene. This wouldn't be a particularly helpful comparison, as modern cameras and a quick single glance from a human would perceive roughly the same range of light from 8 to 12 stops. It's said that humans can perceive around a 24-stop range, but that's not because of the eye. It's because our brains do post-processing to fill in the gap as our eyes make micro-adjustments. This process is mimicked in the iPhone 12 and other smartphones with multiple lenses for high dynamic range. Or maybe he means something else entirely. I can't look it up. But this whole notion of comparison to cameras is strange, because the argument would have been more compelling 100 years ago, and will be less compelling in another 100 years as technology improves. I'm fully expecting there to be mechanical replacement eyes for humans in my lifetime that will be superior to our human ones, or at least my not-so-great eyes. And so, while I'm unconvinced that these are completely accurate, or perhaps merely not phrased precisely, let's just blow through the data that David finds compelling.
The human retina can handle the dynamic range of light of 10 billion to 1 or 10 million times more. There are over 10 million such cells in the retina, and they are packed together with a density of 200,000 per millimeter. Because the retina is thinner than the wavelength of visible light, it is totally transparent. In an article published in the computer magazine Byte, Dr. John Stevens said, to simulate 10 milliseconds of the complete processing of even a single nerve cell from the retina would require the solution of about 500 simultaneous nonlinear differential equations 100 times and would take at least several minutes of processing time on a Cray supercomputer.
I really want to tear into this one. A quote from a 1985 computer magazine, just 2 pages away from an ad for a special deal on a 20 megabyte hard drive for $1,099. For reference, the PDF file I found of the magazine issue is 65 megabytes. So back when this article was written, the contents of just one magazine used over $3,000 in storage. They didn't conceive of a day we'd all have Cray supercomputers in our pockets, mapping bunny ears on our faces in real time. So I'm not sure their awe should inspire the same today. But the point here isn't whether Dave is accurately representing the eye or computational power. The point is that Dave wants us to be impressed with the human eye. And now that we're done with the eye specs, it's time to find out what leading evolution proponents think about it.
Evolutionary biologist Dr. Ernst Mayr considered the Darwin of the 20th century once said, "It is a considerable strain on one's credulity to assume that finely balanced systems, such as certain sense organs, the eye of vertebrates, or the bird's feather, could be improved by random mutations."
Well, that sounds like a quote taken out of context. Sure enough, on page 296 of his 1942 book, Systematics and the Origin of Species, Dr. Mayr acknowledges how counterintuitive some of the evolutionary precepts were to an unfamiliar public, but immediately followed with the reality of the situation. However, the objectors to random mutations have so far been unable to advance any alternative explanation that was supported by substantial evidence. That a notion is counterintuitive has no bearing on whether it is true, and experts in the field acknowledging that the evidence sways them to a different conclusion than their initial intuition might, only undermines the simplistic and error-prone approach that David takes in this video. This is incredibly similar to the Charles Darwin quote about the eye that nearly every creationist takes out of context.
In Origin of Species, Darwin remarked that the whole idea of something so flawless could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, he said, absurd in the highest degree.
Yeah, that one. You didn't disappoint, David. In The Origin of Species, Darwin spent the entire chapter following that sentence with details about his understanding of eye evolution, again refuting the notion that intuition and common sense should be accepted above investigation and evidence to the contrary. The fact is that the proposed mechanisms for human eye evolution are well documented, and most of the stages remain well represented in creatures that are alive today.
The story of the human eye begins with a simple light spot, such as the one found in single-celled organisms, like Euglena. A more complex version of this light spot can be found in the flatworm Planaria. Being cupped rather than flat enables it to better sense the direction of incoming light. Over the millennia, as such light cups grew deeper in some organisms, the opening at the front grew smaller. The result was a pinhole effect, which increased resolution dramatically. The nautilus, an ancestor of the octopus, uses this pinhole eye for improved resolution and directional sensing. The key step towards the eye as we know it is a lens. This is thought to have evolved through transparent cells covering the opening to prevent infection, allowing the inside of the eye to fill with fluid that optimizes light sensitivity and processing. Crystalline proteins forming at the surface created a structure that proved useful in focusing light at a single point on the retina.
It is impressive how far the sophistication of the eye has come since the first photosensitive cells, but that journey was a journey, one step at a time.
Next comes a tiny, little-known creature, the Australian termite.
You don't have termites, do you?
This particular termite differs from all others. In fact, it's 4 creatures in one. Each depends on the others for continued existence, where you cannot have one without all the others.
You can't have one without the other.
Let's see. A curiosity I studied in microbiology class was a microorganism called Mixotricha paradoxa that lives in the gut of Australian termites. When it was first discovered, it looked as if it was covered with a bunch of curly hairs. Looking closer, it was revealed that these were not hairs at all, but spirochetes, a totally different type of microorganism. On the Mixotricha, there were bumps or appendages where the spirochetes attached, and bacillus which lodged on the other side of the bump. The spirochetes provide a means of locomotion for the entire colony of microorganisms. They are three totally different germs that decided to live together in a community. So, what you have is an interdependence between a large microorganism, a spirochete, a bacillus, an Australian termite, and even the trees the termites feed upon. I suppose if you're an evolutionist, you would have to believe that at one point in time they formed a committee and decided to all work together.
I'm not sure if David is trying to make a joke with this caricature, or if he's wildly mistaken about biological evolution, or perhaps some of each. But taken at sincere face value, no. There was obviously no committee meeting of non-sentient organisms. Evolution is undesigned, and guided only by whatever allows life to have greater reproductive success. There are papers on the evolution of the Australian termite ecosystem that David could have looked up and read, if he'd been so inclined. And while we could get into it, the symbiotic relationships that creationists will point to generally fall into the same pattern of development. So I'm going to start with an analogy that, while far from perfect, can hopefully shed some light on the general mechanism, and then we can move back to the specifics. Let's start with a hypothetical society of Glompville, filled with creatures named glomps who eat only glomp dogs. Now, glomp dogs are a specially fried triangle-shaped protein plant inside a triangle-shaped bun pocket that glomps find delicious even though surrounding communities think they're smelly and gross. The company that cooks and assembles glomp dogs is called Conco. The company that sells and grows the protein is called Home Beauty. And the company that makes and sells the bun pockets is called Yamarama. Life in Glompville was very different many generations ago. Few glomps had jobs because they spent all day scrounging for food like berries and bugs and roots. The fine folks at Yamarama made a variety of delicious treats of many shapes, but with little nutrition value, glomps still needed to forage to live. Home Beauty made plant arrangements to brighten people's lives a little. And Conco was a place you could trade all kinds of things, from berries to bugs to delicious treats from all over. One day, a glomp was so hungry, they decided to eat their Home Beauty decorations. Lo and behold, the triangle plants in the arrangement tasted terrible, but were a good source of nutrition. Word spread in Glompville, so sales of arrangements containing triangle plants started to increase. Unhappy with the taste of their triangle plant lunches, glomps started picking up more treats from Conco. One bite triangle plant, one bite bun seemed to be the perfect ratio. Because Conco had standard cone sizes for holding purchases, it was easy for glomps to get one cone of each ingredient. With sales increasing for triangle arrangements, Home Beauty put more triangles in each arrangement, and eventually started making triangle-only arrangements for Conco. Meanwhile, with glomps looking for the perfect bun-to-triangle ratio, the biggest Yamarama treats started selling the best. Yamarama started to make really big buns, but those were too big and didn't sell as well as the new medium size, where sales took off. With no discernible shape to the buns, the ones more closely approximating triangle sold first, so more and more triangle buns were made. Gradually, Homebody stopped making plant arrangements for interiors to focus exclusively on triangle plants for food. Now it's all they sell. Similarly, Yamarama now makes only triangle-shaped buns of the perfect size, and Conco combines the bun and the plant for the consumer into a so-called glomp dog, now selling nothing else. Meanwhile, glomps who don't like glomp dogs moved away, leaving only glomp dog-loving population to produce glomp dog-loving children.
Interdependence and ecology are problems for evolutionists. These principles demonstrate there are delicate balances between all of the different species on the Earth, and that each is dependent on the other.
Now, our friend David will look at this Glompville situation and see how intricately intertwined that Conco, Home Beauty, Yamarama, and the glomps are, and insist that it must have always been this way, that a masterful community planner obviously set the pieces into place from the beginning. But that's not what happened. Virtually all symbiotic ecosystems have some version of this narrative. Unrelated entities begin to coexist, then help each other, then rely on each other, and then become inseparable. Someone observing the last stages can easily miss all the prior stages and trial and error that made the end result so seamless.
So obviously, this proves special creation of all four creatures at the same time. They could not have developed separately and survived to eventually rendezvous for interdependent existence.
Again, David is ignoring that organisms co-evolve. The ability to cooperate to survive is obviously a survival advantage that natural selection will favor. It doesn't matter if the interdependence is in the gut of a termite or
unique relationship between koala bears and eucalyptus trees. Both are only native to Australia. Koalas eat nothing but eucalyptus leaves, often living their entire lives in one grove. They also derive moisture from these leaves because they almost never drink water. Koalas possess specific microorganisms in their digestive systems required to break down elements in eucalyptus leaves that are toxic to all other creatures. These toxins actually convert into vitamins. How did koalas evolve unless they were created with these microorganisms already present in their stomachs? Otherwise, they would have eaten the leaves and died. Yet their systems are so specific, they can only survive on these leaves.
I trust you figured this out on your own. The distant ancestors to koalas would have had a non-eucalyptus diet, but a favorable mutation at some point would have allowed some koalas to not die from eucalyptus, maybe only get sick. So these koala ancestors slowly added the plant to their diet, and those with mutations to help digest the plant having more kids than those who couldn't. Because the plant is so plentiful, and with no competition for other animals to eat it, the plant went from rare snack to side dish to main meal to eventually such specialization that it's all they can eat. Once you understand how evolution works, such situations are not a surprise. They're perfectly logical.
Sadly, rejecting creation by God, evolutionists must conclude, what luck for koalas that just the right microorganisms entered their system at the exact same time they developed a taste for only eucalyptus leaves. No, this proves God created koalas.
There is some luck in the right mutations happening, but there are many mutations in each individual offspring, which is multiplied across the full population of each generation. And the successes carry on where the failures don't. So evolution is stacking success upon success. Obviously, what I sketched isn't the full picture. If you want a 400-page version, check out Koala, Origins of an Icon, published in 2011 by PhD zoologist Stephen Jackson. Or search Koala Evolution on scholar.google.com for over 14,000 peer-reviewed papers on the subject. The relatively recent gene sequencing of koalas has led to the discovery of a koala-specific endogenous retrovirus marker that has taken hold in the population only hundreds of years ago, which has potential to teach us a lot about this bit of science that convinced me about the veracity of evolution. See my endogenous retrovirus video for more.
The next amazing quote demonstrates the impossibility of whales and dolphins evolving. It lies in context with a larger statement about why there is no fossil record showing what would have to be almost endless transitions of development.
David is simply misinformed here, as the fossil record for whale and dolphin ancestry is well populated.
Presumably, in order for dolphins and whales to have evolved, they must have originated from a land mammal that returned to the water and changed into a sea creature.
That is correct. Creatures related to land animal Pakicetus began utilizing the ocean as a source of food, adapting more and more over generations past the point where it no longer returned to land.
But dolphins and whales have so many remarkable features upon which their survival depends that they couldn't have evolved. It would be a lot like trying to change a bus into a submarine, one part at a time, all while it is traveling at 60 miles per hour.
I don't know what traveling at 60 miles per hour is supposed to be referring to here. As we discussed, individual animals don't change DNA in their life. Variations are introduced in their offspring. So if you wanted to keep this bus metaphor, it would have to be that every time you buy a new bus, you get a model slightly better adapted to water than your previous bus, until finally you're just buying a submarine or something. It's a bad analogy.
The following is a list of transitions evolutionists have to account for in the dolphin in its evolution from some unknown land-dwelling pre-dolphin. 1. The nose would have to move to the back of the head.
Correct. We see this drift in the fossil record.
2. Feet, claws, and tail would be exchanged for fins and flippers.
Not exchanged. Feet, claws, and tail slowly adapted into functional fins. If you look at the skeleton of a whale, you can clearly see the 5 digits that were the 5 fingers on the paws of its ancestors. There would be no reason for God to give 5 fingers to whales.
3. It would have to develop a torpedo-shaped body for efficient swimming in the water.
Correct. We see this gradual drift in the fossil record.
4. It would have to be able to drink seawater and desalinize it.
David is a little off on his research here. Whales and dolphins don't voluntarily drink seawater. It's a problem for them. They actually have to get their water needs from the foods they eat and their internal metabolic processes. They don't desalinize.
5. Its entire bone structure and metabolism would have to be rearranged.
As you can see from the various transitional forms, the bone structure changed relatively little, and no bones were rearranged. Whales even have vestiges of their pelvis and hind legs.
6. It would need to develop a sophisticated sonar system to search for food.
This is true, and of all the things listed, this is the most interesting development. While much more study is needed on all the incremental steps, papers like this one identify that anatomical correlates for the production, phonic lips on the forehead, transmission through the melon giving the dolphin's forehead its typical outline, and reception via a fat pad in the mandible of ultrasonic sounds are found in all modern odontocetes, that is, ancestors of modern whales and dolphins. Once again, we need not imagine that such abilities magically appeared. For all the so-called irreducibly complex examples David imagines, incremental development paths have been identified and studied.
Could the dolphin acquire these features gradually, one at a time, over millions of years? What about the transitional stages? Would they have survived with just some of these features?
Of course they would. A creature with his nose slightly further up on his head is going to survive in the water better than his ancestor with it further down, though not quite as well as his eventual descendant with it even further up. David is confused about how this works.
Why is there a total absence of transitional forms fossilized?
Total absence, except for all the ones we have.
For me, it takes a great stretch of the imagination to picture the evolution of dolphins and whales.
Okay, but your failure to imagine something or to understand something doesn't make it false. I was just like David once, making these kind of assumptions about evolutionary claims without actually having studied them for myself. And then I did, and it all made sense. If David's questions sound like your questions, might I encourage you to do some more study before you disparage? You don't need to believe in evolution, but you should at least understand what you don't believe.
It must be concluded both were created. Any overview of birds reveals remarkable facts.
Okay, wow. Now we've just jumped to birds.
In one bird, females gather food while males tend the eggs. And when did the sexes diverge for birds or any other animal?
Excellent question. Sexual reproduction can be traced back to earlier prokaryotes, but the kind of sexual reproduction we see in birds, fish, mammals, and even plants likely developed in early eukaryotes. Since everything in that list is descended from eukaryotes, and still are eukaryotes, they all inherited sexual reproduction from the same ancestors, though obviously different families and species have specialized the mechanisms.
Even some plants are male and female. How did this happen?
Again, since plants are also descended from eukaryotes, they inherited this trait along with animals.
Hummingbirds represent true creative genius.
Okay, back to birds. This is rapid fire. Now, no one is going to deny that hummingbirds are amazing creatures. If you'd like to spend some time hearing all about their capabilities, might I recommend a good documentary rather than David's stunted proclamations? Suffice to say that he's incredulous about the gradual emergence of such features, insisting that only this current form makes sense. When pondering such things, ask yourself, could a creature survive with a less advanced version of this characteristic in question? Invariably, the answer is yes.
Could all of this have evolved or just happened?
I hope you're catching on by now that evolved and just happened are not synonymous. Maybe in the vague sense that they're unguided, but evolution is the accumulation of small successes.
Like bumblebees, which also appear to completely defy the laws of physics and flying ability, the hummingbird is just as unique but even closer to aerodynamic perfection.
The notion of perfection is smuggling in the notion of design to the discussion. Biology is concerned with survival and improvement, not arbitrary standards.
The female angler has a lure hanging from an appendage on her nose. It attracts fish so she can strike and swallow them.
Bioluminescence is a common adaptation in deep-sea creatures, and many others as well. The anglerfish has bioluminescence localized to a focused appendage. While effective and novel-looking to humans, this isn't an inexplicable deviation from the general fish body plan.
The male does not have one because he never eats. Rather, he attaches himself to the female, allowing their bloodstreams to merge, thus feeding him.
Of the 160 species of angler, only some 25 engage in what Wired magazine calls the worst sex on Earth. It's strange, but the path to this kind of specialization and interdependence is fundamentally the same as the termite digestion and the koala diet. What was once an option for the creature eventually just became the way it was done, and the other options were eventually lost due to lack of use.
Evolutionists have no explanation for anglerfish,
except for these 25,000 peer-reviewed papers on the topic.
But evolution asks us to break stride from what is natural to believe and then believe in that which is unnatural, unreasonable, and unbelievable.
Again, your own personal acceptance, understanding, or incredulity isn't a factor in whether something is true or not.
It is a shock to us in the 20th century to discover, from observations science has made, that the fundamental mechanisms of life cannot be ascribed to natural selection and therefore were designed.
Well, that's a false dichotomy, isn't it? There are other options other than natural selection and design. If evolutionary ideas were definitively proven false tomorrow, that wouldn't actually prove that life was designed. Design of life is a separate claim that would need its own evidence and falsification criteria. But if there are mechanisms of life incompatible with natural selection, they haven't been presented here today. David doesn't need to accept the explanations, but they are readily available.
But we must deal with our shock as best we can and go on.
You should take this advice, David.
The theory of undirected evolution is already dead, but the work of science continues.
Yes, if the theory of evolution is dead, someone forgot to tell science about it.
Remember, true science always harmonizes with the facts, all of them. Believers in God or creation need never fear the facts of science.
Most Christians would agree with that sentiment, and that's why the majority of Christians in the world simply accept the verifiable conclusion that biological evolution is true.
This author concluded by implying there is directed evolution, often called theistic evolution, meaning God directed the gradual process of all things evolving. Many like to declare, I believe in God, I just think evolution was his method of choice. This introduces a truly great question. Can Christians accept evolution? Is this compatible with the Bible and following Jesus Christ?
As an atheist, that's not for me to decide for you. For me, they're incompatible. But millions of Christians have no trouble in harmonizing these things.
What does the New Testament say? What did Christ say? I will answer these questions in detail following this series. Look for, can a Christian believe evolution? You will be shocked.
I suspect this is turning into an interpretation contest about who are and who are not Christians. I'll leave that as homework to interested viewers.
Of course, again, honest theologians would never deny science. The author of science, God, would certainly not be in conflict with what he authored.
I think the more relevant question is, if evolution is as problematic as David claims, why would any Christian be convinced of its veracity? What motivation could a believer have to be dishonest, as David accuses them? Sure, non-believers can be convinced, but why do most believers also buy in? Because the evidence is strong, conclusive. I have great sympathy for those who find problems with evolution because of a lack of understanding. I myself was such a person just a few short years ago. But it has to be observed that only the most literal of fundamentalists are questioning evolution. It's worth the question, Is it more likely that millions of dedicated biologists are completely wrong? Or is it more likely that perhaps you are interpreting the meaning of an ancient text in a way not intended?
Let's at least pause to ask, why are people, maybe including you, willing to believe the proof that God created the heavens and the earth as He said, but not willing to believe He created all life on earth, plants and animals, as He said?
Is it because the verifiable truth of biological evolution doesn't actually conflict with the idea that God created life on earth? It just conflicts with one interpretation of a text?
Now, don't miss the final 2 parts of this vital series.
Well, we're 3/5 of the way done. I guess we might as well get to the end. Stay tuned. If you'd like to review the previous entries, click on the thumbnail on the screen now, and I'll see you over there.
Until next time, this is David C. Pack saying goodbye, friends.
Later.